All right. Hello, beautiful humans, and welcome back to another episode at the Bitcoin Stoa. As a reminder, this is a community funded project. So if you enjoy listening, you can support our work by sending some sats to the QR code on our homepage at bitcoinstoa.com. And you can also stream sats using a Bitcoin wallet that has a podcast feature. Right now, I'm using Breeze Wallet and I'm experimenting with Fountain, and they both have really good experiences. So try them out if you haven't already. Current Moscow time is 26:16 at 7:34, 7:45. And with that said, it is my honor to welcome John Vallis to the Stoa for our conversation about health. So, John, welcome.
Nick, thanks for having me, man. I'm really looking forward to this.
Oh, well, I'm grateful for your time. We're all busy, and I think the most Bitcoiners are very generous with their time, and that always astounds me, and it gives me inspiration to kind of live up to. But I've really been looking forward to this conversation since last week, sort of when we scheduled it. For those listening, if you don't already know John, he's a leading podcaster and writer in the Bitcoin space. So I encourage you to explore his work. It's very powerful stuff. And John, I want to personally thank you for your work because your podcast with Michael Saylor about Bitcoin as empowerment is really what inspired me to focus sort of my life energy on mastering the art and science of orange pilling and shifting full time into that. So, it's been a very rewarding journey so far. And without you creating that content, it might not have happened. So thank you.
Well, that brings me great joy to hear that.
Amazing.
And, I think part of the reason why Bitcoiners are so generous with their time is twofold. One, there's this like missionary component of things where you know that these conversations will serve that purpose. And so, you want to contribute to the orange pilling of the world, as it were. And then every Bitcoiner is thinking about Bitcoin at all times, and they want to talk about it. They need an outlet for that. And so I think those two reasons are why we're so willing to participate in these sorts of things. Beyond the fact that, I'm a huge fan of yours as well. And it's, just a pleasure to get to jam with you.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd add an element number 3. When you use money that doesn't steal your time, you end up having a surplus of time, which I think we can connect that into health throughout our conversation. But today is going to be focused on health. Usually we open up Stoa episodes with hearing people's Bitcoin story, but I don't want to waste any time. And I figured a good place to start, you mentioned through Twitter, through our messages, that health has been a big part of your life. And I'm a big proponent of the power of story. And so how about we start with your health story? And then we can get into discussing and unpacking specific concepts related to health. But I guess, to frame this, it's how has health played a role in your life personally? And maybe share some of the more memorable experiences or inflection points along the way that have sort of shaped who you are today and your current view of health. So let's start there, and floor is yours.
We've got the time today, so this might be a longer winded response than I've given in previous stuff. But also, if I got choked out hard yesterday in jiu-jitsu, speaking of health, so my throat is a little bit sore. All so good. If I'm not coming through as clearly as usual, I apologize. Where to start? I mean, usually the story goes something like, I was a fat kid. I loved cookies and candy and all that jazz when I was a kid. And like my parents tried to feed us well, throughout the week. And then on the weekend we could have pizza and that kind of jazz. But, there was a corner store 50 yards from our house, and I would go there all the time with the change I'd scrounged up from the couch cushions and just go get sour candies and, eat it with my buddies on the street. And I guess part of the redeeming quality that we played outside a lot. So we were active, which seems to be a foreign concept, in the current era for young kids. But nevertheless, I was not considering health at all as a youngster. And so, and I guess I just had a disposition to be larger, so slow metabolism, perhaps, who knows. But anyways, I was a fat kid, and I was always kind of tall, so that it meant that it wasn't as apparent. But like when I think I was 200 pounds when I was 13 or something like that. But in any case, the thing that I remember the most about kind of starting the journey was my dad and I were into like camping and hiking and that kind of stuff. And we were in Sport Check one day, and there was like one of those camping lighters, good in the wind and the rain and upside down and, all that jazz. And it was $50. And I made a bet with my dad that if I didn't eat any junk for a month, that he would get me the lighter. And I guess as a father, you know, he was more than happy to hear me, you know, any opportunity to get me. He was a very active guy, right? He used to do triathlons when he was younger and into a lot of sports, like always very active. And so I can imagine he was more than happy to, you know, take that wager.
Do you think he thought you
And
would succeed?
I don't know. I mean, I gotta think he was hoping for the best and he was optimistic, but you know, he'd probably seen just how what I was like prior to that. And maybe he didn't have much hope. But in any case, I did do it, and I didn't have cookies and I didn't have candy and all that jazz for a month. And I lost 15 pounds. And I thought, wow, that's cool. And then I did it for another month and lost another 15 pounds. And then I was just like, fuck the lighter. This is way cooler, you know? So, you know, you start seeing like veins pop out of your hands and arms where like it was just chub before. And you're like, wow, I want more of this, you know? And so I think that was at something, you know, 12, 13 years of age. And so I started like being more cognizant of what I was putting in my body, and I started being more active and got into like weightlifting a lot back then. You know, it was funny, in preparation for this discussion today, yesterday I was just thinking about like how this journey started. And, you know, when I first got going on it, like I was reading, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger's books on bodybuilding, and like, cause that was the thing at the time. Like if you wanted to be, I don't know, fit in that era, at least it seemed to me like everyone just lifted weights and tried to be jacked, right? And so,
Yep.
you know, you start getting the protein powder from the local supplement shop, and you're reading Flex magazine, and you're listening to Arnie's documentary and Ronnie Coleman and all those people. And so anyways, that was kind of it. And I still played sports, played tennis, played basketball and stuff in high school. But like, I really started watching what I was putting in my body. And like, of course, what I thought was quote unquote healthy then is very different than what I think of as healthy now. So like the intervening, well, 15 years, almost 20 years. Yeah, over 20 years actually. Fuck. Has been, you know, a journey of figuring out what works best for my body, what makes me feel best, what makes me perform best. And, you know, nobody's perfect, so it kind of waxes and wanes, but it's been interesting to always be on that journey. And so, but I realized quite early on, willpower alone was going to be exhausting. You know, like if you just, he's like, oh, I need to go to the gym today, because if I don't, I'll go backwards and I won't get to where I want to go. And if it's a food, like, oh, I really want to eat this, but if I do, and you know, like, oh, staying away from the Nutella that's in the cupboard, it's so hard. And so I started to think like, I started to recognize that belief was not something that you really chose. Like you acted on beliefs, right? Beliefs kind of come natural to you. Then you can determine whether or not you're going to act in conformity with them, or you're going to try to oppose them to some degree. Right. And so like just relying on willpower felt like opposing it felt like opposing what my body wanted to do. And I thought if I could align my belief with what I wanted the outcome to be, then the act would be much easier. It would come naturally. And but then it begs the question, like, yeah, well, how do you instill belief? How do you cultivate belief? You can't just tell yourself, hey, believe this to be true, or believe this thing, because that's not how it works, which is really interesting, right? It's like, well, where do our default beliefs or thoughts or preferences come from? Like you don't decide if you like a certain food or not. You either do or you don't, and you act on it.
I think the environment, people often discount the impact of, sorry to interrupt, but like the impact of the environment, right? You can have the most intentional beliefs and desire and even discipline to act a certain way. But at the end of the day, the environment, the invisible hand that is the environment around us, is such a powerful force in shaping our behavior that you can have stone cold beliefs and discipline, but put yourself in an environment where the temptation to eat the wrong things or do the wrong things is there. And it's like swimming upstream. And so I think, you know, like, I just think the environment is such an important element that people underestimate. And the beauty about the environment is you make a one-time change, you can now have a totally different context to act within. Whereas instead of having to decide each time, you decide once not to put the foods you don't want to eat in your house, you don't have to decide again. So yeah, that's an interesting point.
No, that's definitely, you got to do that, right? That's like kind of step one, to make sure you're not enticing yourself unnecessarily, right? But even still, I found that the actions that would lead to the outcome I was seeking were not the ones that came most naturally, the ones that I most wanted to take naturally. And so, I started to wonder about, like, how does one cultivate belief? And, that leads you down the inquiry of, psychology and philosophy and, all sorts of tangential fields of study or inquiry around just, basic health, because that run, the idea of what your beliefs are and from where you derive them is like extremely fundamental to who we are. And I think that the outcome of that pursuit was, and I mean, this pretty much runs as deep as you can in the spiritual or theological or religious domains. It's like, it seemed to me that the only way to do that was to try to perceive as clearly as possible truth, and then orient yourself around that. And like, if truth was the main aim, I guess there's a type of faith in that if you're perceiving and pursuing truth to the maximum extent possible, then the behaviors that's going to elicit will be beneficial to you. And that, I think that is like an article of faith almost, about how all this stuff is constituted. And so the name of the game for me then became like, how do I like establish as much clarity as possible? And that's mostly in the realm of like consciousness and conscious thinking. And so, because I mean, you think about it, we know that like your gut bacteria affects your thoughts and your energy levels and your perception to a certain degree, right? Serotonin and stuff like that. We know the same is true for what stimulants you've had throughout the course of the day. The same is true for whether you had, fat and protein or carbs in the morning. Same is true as whether you had a good sleep or not, or whether you had a fight with a spouse, or whether you've had sunlight, or whether you've had time in nature. Like, all of these things affect your perception. And so the question is, it's like, well, what does perception look like when it's minimally influenced by these extraneous factors? And, the answer to that question, or the reason why I think the idea of purifying the body shows up in so many different spiritual traditions throughout the world, Asia, South America, Europe, pretty much everywhere, is for that reason, because these practices were kind of meant to remove both the physiological and the psychological or conscious impediments to seeing truth as clearly as possible, and allowing that to be integrated fully into your, body, mind, and spirit, as it were. And so, I started that kind of change in me started to create a reorientation around my automatically doing the things that would most facilitate that clarity that I thought was the most valuable thing in pursuing truth to the extent that it was possible to do so. And so that meant that, like, well, all the things that went into that, which over the course of 20 years I've discovered are, working the body hard and often so that you kind of flush out the system, you get a good sweat, you get your lungs burning, doing so in nature if possible, doing so early in the morning, having certain following a certain dietary regimen that seems to work for me, which broadly speaking, or simply speaking, is, fats and protein in the morning and carbs pushed to the evening, when, and I do that because the carbs tend to, like, maybe as a result of an insulin dump or something, they kind of make me drowsy or sleepy. And so pushing that to the end of the day, and then obviously getting a good sleep and cultivating good relationships and engaging in meaningful work, like all these things are part of that overarching attempting to engage with truth as much as possible. But what I found, and this goes back to the point about belief, is like, because that's so genuine, all the different activities required to make that happen are effortless. It's like, it's not a matter of discipline for me to go for a run or to have a workout or anything like that. Like, because I know that those things are going to lead to the state that I most desire. Right. So it's like, I'm not fighting myself anymore. It's all very yeah, it's lined up, and it seems like the proper way. Not to say that I've perfected it, and as you go through life, you find all these little tweaks that make that better, and you find you learn more and you integrate what you learn. But the punchline is like most of this is consciously oriented. So like for the last several years, my ambitions for my health and my physiology, I guess, have been to focus on what most fosters clarity in my mind. And it seems to be the case that if I do those things, many of which I just listed, what happens physiologically in the body will be acceptable to me. Like it will also be good for the body, and to the extent that, and it's acceptable to me. And so part of that is, another thing is like, I mentioned I used to, when I first got into weightlifting when I was 15 or so, I'd buy the, Optimum Nutrition protein powder and read the magazines, all that jazz. But now, like for me, a potential impediment or dependency is not being able to maintain the regimen that's delivering that clarity, no matter where I might be in the world or in whatever circumstance. And so at this point, I don't want to integrate anything that I can't maintain within reason anywhere, and so, that means for me, like I don't, and this may change, but for the last, decade plus, I don't lift weights. It's all body weight stuff that I can do out near like a tree branch or on the beach or on a running trail or something like that. No supplements, or, it's all natural food that's broadly available anywhere you might go. It's just that there's no real dependencies that make it unmaintainable, no matter where I might be in the world. And,
yeah, like you talk about truth, and to me, like this whole notion of default settings, right? Like I think almost the belief of trusting that our physiology is extremely impressive. I think that has to be a fundamental belief that people hold in order for them to trust that this machine, like my first principles with health are the body adapts to what I expose it to. My body is a self-organizing system and a self-healing system. So all of the work of having to try and micromanage or make sure my body's doing the right thing sort of gets pushed off. And it's like, all I have to do is give my body the right inputs, the inputs that align with my natural biology, right? To restore my default settings, which are healthy, resilient, strong, and basically peaceful. Like that is the default state of human beings. And so health then becomes not necessarily seeking external things to add. It sort of becomes the process of mindful experimentation, where you experiment with subtracting things from your life that may have gotten you off the path of default settings. And yeah, I just think I would even love to hear your thoughts on this, because you ask 100 people how they define health, you'll get 100 different answers, and they'll vary widely. And I think fundamentally health should be a subjective term, because each of us must craft our own definition of health, which we then make a decision to pursue, right? I can't tell you what health is. You can't tell me what health is. But I think it's important to develop sort of a sense of meaning in what health is, right? Like, people sometimes ask me, what do I do to be healthy? I'm like, well, how do you define health? And they can't define it. It's like, well, you just asked me how to get to a place that you don't even know of. So you're probably not going to get there. Right. So how do you define health? Like in simple terms, in a sentence or two, how would you define health, and sort of how has that manifested through your experience? How has your experience brought you to that definition, and how does that definition serve you in the practice of health?
The one that comes immediately to mind is just optimal fittedness for your aims, or optimal fitness for your aims, right? Maybe that's why we call it fitness, right? And that's, why we use the term fitness in nature when we're talking about evolutionary fitness, right? Like how fit is the organism for its environment and for its, ambitions or aims or goals within that environment. And that's probably, like you can put more words on it, right? And it's, maybe to be strong or to be healthy, to be fast or to be all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think as far as the discussion we've been having so far, it's like, it seems like one of my overarching aims is the establishment of greater clarity, such that I might perceive greater truth in it, in a nutshell. And it would seem to be the case that my efforts in the quote unquote health or fitness realm have been to facilitate that. And so it seems like what I'm trying to do is make myself more fit for the aim that I'm striving for.
And as your aim changes, so too must your fitness, right? Like I think an important part that I think people misconstrue with health is they view health as a destination, right? It could be an image, it could be
I was
being
just
pain-free.
thinking that, yeah.
And like the whole notion that it's a process sort of gets lost on people, I think. And, you know, not being able to reach this destination you formed in, you know, based on basically your programming of what people told you health is, not being able to reach that ephemeral state is what gets people sort of down and out, that they're not able to be healthy. But if you view health as the process of just learning how to take better care of yourself, then health is achievable to everyone, right? Like the person who's 250 pounds overweight might get a little bit discouraged if they look at health as like some shredded physique on a magazine. It's like, oh, I'm so far from that. But I think the whole notion of instilling in people that health is a process, mostly of learning about yourself and how to take better care of yourself, and that health is like the end. Health is the output of many small inputs consistently done over time, not like these mega doses of resolutions. And yeah, just this whole notion that health is a lifelong process, and your definition of being fit for the aims that you're striving towards, and then the idea that our aims change constantly as the world changes, means that your fitness must be constantly reevaluated and realigned with those aims.
I think that's true. The only caveat I would add is that the aim that I've been describing of, you know, greater clarity of perception around capital T and all lowercase t truths, I think that encompasses, like, there'll be smaller aims within that, right? Like if I ever want to train for like a Spartan race or a triathlon or a particular occupation, like you're right, and that will alter the regimen. But in terms of like the overarching, because it's, you know, if you're just beginning on this, like if I was talking with my mom or something and trying to give her advice, because she kind of falls into the category you mentioned, where like these fits and starts and it's overly ambitious at the beginning and then there's demotivation and all that stuff. And so I think like incremental and directional is important when you're just getting started. But once you like flip the switch, this will sound corny, but like when I'm out for a trail run, for example, I'm not saying I need to do this to be delivered to the state that I want afterwards. The doing of it is the deliverance of the state. Ooh. You know, there's residual effects, but like it's a this is super corny, but it's like a celebration when it's happening. Like I love everything about those states, both the challenge of them and the feeling in the moment and the feedback with your own body, like the sense of being in it and being sensitized to the environment. And, you know, when that switch that I was trying to find words to articulate earlier, like, it's not just that it becomes easy to accept the work necessary for the outcome. It's that the very work becomes an integral and enjoyable part of what's being delivered as the outcome, you know, so they're not separated really. And like, I can appreciate,
not a means to an end. The work itself is the end, right?
Right. I mean, again, this language could be transposed to religious or spiritual language that's been written of, you know, for thousands of years as well. And I think there's a reason for that. It's because if your aim is oriented towards, let's say, the highest aim, however you might articulate that, then the means by which you move closer to the aim is literally the reward, because that's what you're aiming, that's what you're trying to do.
Right. Yeah. And the hard part is how do you articulate that, right? Like you know, and I mean, it's very profound, because I couldn't agree more. It's like, I don't look at buying real food versus delicious mouth pleasure for 5 minutes. I don't look at that as like something I have to work hard to do. Like, I want to do that because I know, and it's almost like, I think the mindful element of, you know, mindful experimentation, meaning that go in with an open mind and explore health broadly, try a bunch of different things, even wacky things, but it must be done with enough mindfulness so that you remember what works and what doesn't, right? Because the 5 minutes of mouth pleasure is amazing. You can eat a whole chocolate cake. It's great. But what is the like 2 or 3 hours later? What does that look like? And if you remember how shitty you feel after that, the 5 minutes of most pleasure doesn't become worth it, right? Like it's almost like you develop a lower time preference with health as a whole as you do experiments and really tune into the effects, not just at the time, but like later on. And you learn to realize the things that make you feel better in the long term are often hard work in the short term. And so, I'd love to hear your thoughts on like health is a lot of work. In an environment built around disease, health can be a lot of work. Obviously, you can put yourself in an environment that is conducive to health, and it's not as much work as it is just living. But I think for a lot of people, health is a lot of work. It requires energy to tune yourself into the process of taking better care of yourself and seeing what works and what doesn't. So what would you say is you've already kind of talked on this, but I always love to understand people's primary motivation for the work. Because without the motivation, maybe the work is not as attractive or is harder to do. So what motivates you to be health, to follow the pursuit of health?
Yeah, I will answer that, but I just want to say on your prior point, like I still eat, like on Saturday nights when the UFC fights are on, me and my girlfriend, we get a whack of pizza, get a whack of beer, get some brownies for dessert, and we go hog on it. Like I don't think, like, as we've been discussing, like if you're strictly trying to adhere to a rigid and basically arbitrary or somewhat arbitrary notion of what you're supposed to be doing in order to achieve a supposed end, then it's going to seem like work, and so like we eat the pizza, we enjoy it, there's no guilt involved, and then it's back. It's not even like that's off course. Like that's a part
that is
of
healthy in that instance.
Right, exactly. Right. Exactly. And the other thing about, and this may tie into the question you just asked, but I think a big part of the problem that we face in global culture today, and what makes this extra hard, is that to your very question about like, well, what's the purpose, right? Why are you doing all this? What's the aim, as we've been discussing? If you can't, if the validity of the aim can't manifest itself in value in your life, then its motivating force is going to be much less. And by that, I mean, like, you and I may have a certain degree of autonomy or alignment with our work and our practices and how we show up and how we provide and take value from the world, let's say, right? Like the more, broadly speaking, like the more independently you can pursue the things that interest you, right? Maybe it's because you have a whack of freedom money. Maybe it's because you've just, you recognized it earlier and you dedicated yourself to something you love and you've wound up in a career around that, whatever the case may be. You're aligning, like you're stacking all of those things up so that they all feed in and amplify one another. But if you're stuck in a career track, a job, a lifestyle that you hate, and that, so like you may want to do all these things, but it's toward perhaps an aim that doesn't actually cohere that well with like what you have to show up and do on a regular basis. Like the gulf between those two can obviously detract from the motivation of it. And so that's why, like, when we talk about health, it basically, we're just talking about living. Like, what is your approach to optimizing your experience of life or consciousness? Like, that's what it is. It's not like, how often do you go to the gym and what do you eat? And then you go sit in an office from 9 to 5 in a job you hate and get blasted on the weekends and have terrible relationships. But I'm healthy and I run 100 miles a week or whatever it is. Like that doesn't sound like health at all to me. So for me, it's always been, and when I've been least satisfied in life, it's been when I've been trying to stack up, and I've almost always tried to maintain a piece of that picture, right? Because if you let the whole picture go, then it's a really disastrous, scenario. So even in those periods, like in career-wise, I was really unsatisfied and it made me very unhappy. I tried to maintain the other components because at least that gives you a buffer, right? At least it doesn't like cause things to spiral too far down. And like you can tread water, as it were, and wait for a different domain of that mix to improve. But I think the goal of everybody is to, and maybe this is the point of establishing greater health and strength and clarity of mind, is in determining what it is that your aim should be. like what experience of life are you seeking, and what experience of life or awareness or what type of perspective would benefit you the most, or would you enjoy the most, or would allow you to extract the most of your potential. And then once, like, and you're not going to get like a, at least I don't think, I never did get like a super clear, well articulated answer to that question. This is why, like, incrementally pursuing these things, when you get an inkling or a sense that they are contributing to something that feels good or positive, and then trying to refine and stack them and refine and stack them and refine and stack them until over the course of time, an experience of life manifests that's better than it was 5 years ago, and better than it was 10 years ago, and better than it was 15 years ago, by virtue of the fact that you've been pursuing this thread in every domain of life. And, so hopefully, it seems to me that an optimized life would be one where you've constructed a lifestyle that is optimally supportive of an aim that you find optimally meaningful. And if you can do that, I think what the experience that will be delivered to you will be one of peace and joy and happiness, basically.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point where it's like, that old saying, it's possible to have everything you want and not be happy, because it's possible to want the wrong things. And I think part of health is revisiting that picture, right? Like that picture inevitably over time starts to get a bit pixelated and blurry. And at that point, you can either react to the world and do things that make you feel better in the short term, because the lack of clarity is I would say a source of suffering, right? And it's energy intensive to bring that back into focus, right? That you talked about how these disparate parts, if you're like doing a lot of things right, but you have a job that just you don't find meaning in, that is a source of suffering. And so you have a choice. You can either spend time with yourself to get better resolution in that frame, right? Like the self-awareness piece, the meditating, the like really thinking about the bigger questions in life. It's like, am I actually pointing my energy towards do I want the right things? The things that I think will make me happy, are those actually things that truly matter in life? Or are they things that I've been programmed to think matter and work towards? And I think part of health is actually reevaluating that frame on a regular basis to determine whether or not you're still, like approaching the lighthouse, or if you've gotten off track. And the other thing too, like back to your point about, watching UFC fights and crushing pizza, and it's not about never getting off track. Getting off track is part of the adventure of keeping on track, right? And you can't talk about any single behavior out of context, I don't think, with health, right? Because running 100 miles and destroying your body, someone might say, well, that's not very healthy. But if that's like the culmination of a huge life goal that gives you the confidence to be fearless in pursuit of your goals, it is really healthy, right? Yeah. And so it's not out of context. We can't say if something is healthy or not, because the person is the one who must determine if it's healthy, and that has to be based on what their aspirations are in life. And
exactly. Yeah. Like, does this allow me to move more expediently or wholly to that aim? Like, because as you say, like, what are the drawbacks of eating pizza instead of, steak and liver, let's say? Well, okay, more carbs, maybe some more artificial ingredients in there, more, processed, whatever. What are the benefits of having a great night, together, and, just the endorphins and the happiness and the strengthening of bonds and stuff that results from those experiences? Like, yeah, they're pretty difficult to compare, which is why, we all have to make those choices for ourselves, and I think also it has to be said, like, I'm not a huge, like, I guess, when did like biohacking really come on the scene? Like, I got into it in like 2012 or 2013, and there's some people in that industry or space are very much on the longevity side of things and trying to like extend life as long as possible. That's never really resonated very much with me. I mean, perhaps it's just the chaos and uncertainty of life that, like, you could be walking across the street and get hit by a bus. So like, I don't think it's that rational to sacrifice too much now for the future, but you have to be very careful with how you mediate that, right? Because there is obviously a benefit to pursuing pursuing things that are worthwhile can take a lot of work and time. And you want to make sure, as we've been discussing, like you're optimizing your ability to move towards those things. But it's, but doing everything at the expense of longevity, it's like, well, what's more important? Something off, like a state that you may arrive at 40 years from now, or the state that's available to you right now. And that's obviously not to say like don't plan and don't have ambitious goals that take time to actualize, but it's like I'm more intent on trying to foster the state of mind that I most desire right now for the ends that I'm trying to achieve. It just so happens to be the case, and again, perhaps this is just one of the things about the universe and the human body, that they tend to promote longevity as well, right? Like if you're taking care of yourself in the way that I've been describing, and the intent purpose is for greater conscious clarity, stable mood, and ability to perceive truth, whatever. I know that that's somewhat of a vague aspiration, but if you do all those things, they're probably going to promote longevity in your body too, right? Like I can't think of really anything that I do to promote the former that detracts from the latter. I mean, they're pretty congruent in that way.
Yeah, it's almost like the more stark the trade-off is, maybe the less close you are to a natural way of, maybe you're playing the wrong game, right? If you have to sacrifice your quality of life for 5 years to get an extra 5 years, it's like, well, number one, is that trade-off worth it? And number two, is there a better way to play the game so you don't have to make that trade-off, right? Like you said, if you're doing what aligns with your desires in life and aligns with your physiology, then that automatically, the output of that is a high quality life and a long life. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I don't know, I find the obsession for indefinite longevity to be an interesting, I think, manifestation of a fear of death, and how, like we want to be God. We want to circumvent natural law whenever we can. And, like this health network that I work for, we talk a lot about death, and this whole notion that acknowledging that life is short is actually what makes life meaningful. And not trying to circumvent the laws of nature, knowing that in order for life to occur, death must occur, right? And this is like a conversation I often have with people who talk about never killing animals in terms of what they eat, which, I respect everyone's opinion, but I think we should have a good conversation. And this whole idea that life can occur without death is not truth, in my opinion. And obviously we get close to animals as a more sentient form of life than, say, a plant or a tree. But at the end of the day, I think living a high quality life without trying to hack our biology to allow way more than what we're given by the universe is not something I'm interested in either. I want to live a good life while I'm here, but I do want to die. I actually do want to, because like I don't want to do it tomorrow. But that's an interesting, our avoidance of death, I think, is an indicator of a chink in our cultural health armor, right? Like not acknowledging death as real shows that we are not at a level of health that we can have those discussions.
I think that our as Bitcoiners, I'm sure we share an opinion that there's many chinks in the current cultural milieu of pretty much every domain, and a healthy relationship with one's own mortality is definitely one of those. And it's understandable, right? But I think this, and again, lots of spiritual and religious traditions explore this territory, and we've dismissed them, broadly speaking, as a culture, to our great detriment, in my opinion. And so I think, developing a healthier relationship with mortality is definitely something that leads to a greater experience of life in the here and now. I also think, this whole like wanting to live forever, freeze yourself, longevity thing is, seems like a fairly strong expression of an egotistical view of oneself, and I mean that not in, ego is somewhat of a difficult thing to talk about. Like being aware.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think because a lot of people hear the word ego and they hear it as someone being egotistical, like I'm the best of that, whatever, versus like ego as the individuated identity of yourself, rather than, let's say, the eternally connected aspect of yourself. And I'm sure we'll discuss psychedelics as part of this conversation, but that was definitely one of the practices and experiences that helped me understand, or at least think I understand, perceive a difference between the two, right? An individuated self, John, these preferences, these identities, these likes, dislikes, experiences, all that kind of stuff. And very useful for moving through the world, moving through the physical world. And I love to be competitive and like in your face when it's right to be so. Like if me and you are doing hill sprints or something like that, we're going to throw down and I'm going to be cheering you the whole time. Like, that's just the way it's going to be. And obviously playful, but like, let's see who's the best is, motherfucker. Like that's how I want to get down. But the other aspect of that is that I've felt I've had experiences that have revealed to me that beyond these individuated physical forms that we have, an aspect of what animates them is eternal and undifferentiated from that which animates everybody else. And that changes your relationship to your mortality, because it causes you to think that even though my physical body will die at death, it seems to be the case that there's something about me, perhaps the most fundamental thing about me, that persists in some way that I can't possibly know or understand, even though I might have, thoughts or inclinations on the matter. And yeah, so when I say that, wanting to extend life is egotistical, what I mean is that I think it's an over-identification with the individuated identity of the self, rather than the eternal and unitive aspect of the self. And I think, it's been very helpful in my life to, mediating the two is kind of the spice of life, to determine how to take the wisdom and the love and the, everything else that's wrapped up in that eternal and united aspect of ourselves, and transmuting them into action of an individual being is like, again, we're in the territory of the great sages and mystics and all these people throughout the ages that try to comment and discuss these things. And it's a constant mediation, if for no other reason, even if you sorted yourself out perfectly, because as you said before, our environment is always changing, and that requires constant adjustment on our behalf to try to determine how we're going to conform to our environment optimally towards, again, moving to achieving our aims, or moving towards our highest aims. And so for me, those experiences and that perspective on things has taken the edge off death a lot, because I don't think, like, when I die, I don't think anything's really going to be lost. And I'm not trying to be like self-deprecating or overly humble here. Like I know people that love me will miss me, but when you boil it down, like, what are the most fundamental aspects of who you are? It's certainly not your name or your country. Those are abstractions, right? It's certainly not the sports team that you support. It's certainly not whatever preferences you have. It seems to me to be the case that it's the degree to which you've been a vessel for transmuting and expressing those highest ideals or values throughout your life. And as we explore these spiritual or theological domains, we try to determine what the primary components of them are. And it seems to me that some of the primary components, and this is a non-exhaustive list, of course, but things like love and truth and freedom and beauty seem to be like fundamental parameters to our experience of consciousness or reality itself. And it seems to me that we're talking about highest aims in life. I think it seems rational to me that one's aims would be to transmute, conform, or be instruments of expressing those things as much as possible through life. And if one does that, then, when one goes away, well, the vessel is gone, but those things that they've been transmuting, for one, the source from which they stem is not gone. And to the degree to which they've been a transmission mechanism for them in their life, so has the transmission gone through them to other people, and it lives on in that way. And I think this is what a lot of those traditions and writers of the past have been attempting to articulate or referring to when they discuss immortality. I don't think it's, the individuated, identified self exists in this world or the next in its current form. It's that if you play the game of life correctly and you cohere with the most fundamental aspects of reality or consciousness or God correctly, then when you die, the degree to which you've done that will persist and carry on, when you're not around anymore. And just like perhaps it's always going to be oversimplified when you're talking about such concepts, but an anecdote that first made me really realize this, and this was even after kind of having that separation of individuated ego and eternal self and psychedelics and stuff. But it was a friend of mine, excuse me, her grandmother passed away, and she was like one of these like sweetest old ladies you've ever met in your life, right? Like I would go over and she would be so kind and sweet and gentle. And, to boot, she actually, her like thing, she was an artist and she would just paint mushrooms. Like that's all she would paint, So maybe when she was younger, she got a dose of like, the touch of God or something like that. Who knows? But she was also still like, she would rib you too, right? Like with a ton of love, but she would like make fun of you and then laugh her ass off. And then and she passed away. And it was just so evident to me that the love that she expressed in her life and in her form was passed on to her children and grandchildren. Like it was just so evident. I could see it all over them. Like they got it from her, and they were now, expressing it in their own lives. And it became so palpable or salient to me that like, that's how it works. And that's how we carry on. And that's because the other aspects of ourself are so transient and ultimately so unimportant, but those things are of the highest importance, and they are, or they can be, eternal if we orient or construct our behavior correctly in this life. And so for that reason, it helps constitute that aim that we've been referring to throughout the conversation. Like what should be the aim? I think it should be being a representative or vessel or aligned or embodiment of those things, and then and that helps you live a good, a right, a beautiful life. And then when it comes time for that to be over, you can take solace in the fact that nothing of import is really going away, other than just another reflection of those things into the world, which of course is perhaps cause for some sorrow, but perhaps even more so celebration when it's all said and done. But that's my perspective on mortality, and I feel like it's helping to orient myself more truthfully while this physical form is alive.
That was really well said. And I think the nugget I took from that is like, even when your biological form expires, the impact you've had on the world lives on indefinitely. And focusing on making a positive impact while you're here and not worrying about what happens when you're gone is what allows, it's almost like compost, right? Like a flower blossoms, it dies, it becomes the raw material for other flowers to be made. And without it composting, those other flowers can't live. And this notion that, that old lady left behind raw material that will live on perpetually through the people she's impacted. And then it becomes a question like, did she actually leave, or did she not? And it's all based on your perception, right? And one thing that kind of came to mind, like one of the big mental models I use with health is that if you want to go super zoomed out and really simplify things into like a mental model of health, I feel like health fundamentally comes through connection, and lack of health is the result of disconnection. And we talk about connection and disconnection, is when you're talking about ego that it made me think of this as like connection to three elements: connection to ourselves, connection to others, and connection to the broader environment, right? To nature, let's call it. And when we disconnect from ourselves and don't have a good relationship with ourselves, I think that's when the ego starts to kind of like creep up. And I agree that, ego is a hard thing to talk about because people love to look at things in binaries, like, oh, that person has no ego. It's like, well, they do. And the reason you probably think they have no ego is because they have a really good relationship with their ego, right? Like they talk to it regularly and they acknowledge it as real, and they ensure that they are driving the bus and the ego is not driving. And I think this whole notion of, if we don't connect with nature, if we don't connect with others, and we don't connect with ourselves, then health will always escape us. And those connections, like they're not, they don't cost money, right? Like, we're always being told that this thing that costs money will solve this problem. When the most fundamental element is like, just reconnect with what it means to be a human by shedding all the programming and just getting back to default settings, getting back to like having real meaningful relationships with others, getting back to having meaningful relationships with ourselves, right? The amount of people that do shit to their bodies because they don't like themselves is like, well, that won't stop until you acknowledge the relationship that you have with yourself. But I'd love to explore this idea of health as, as Bitcoiners, we understand proof of work, right? We're the concept and the importance of the concept is known to a lot of us, but I really feel like health is proof of work. Like health, like it's funny. I've started to view health through the lens of a Bitcoiner. How everyone views Bitcoin through whatever lens they come from. If you're a financial person, you view Bitcoin through a financial lens, or et cetera. And starting to view health through the lens of Bitcoin, I'm like, holy shit! There's a lot of natural laws that seem to show up, and one of them is proof of work. In as much as the current state of your health is the proof of the work you've put in to take care of yourself. So I guess, what are your thoughts on the notion of health as proof of work, and how can you unpack that for someone who maybe isn't, like, maybe define conceptually what is proof of work, and then in your perspective, do you view health as proof of work, and if so, sort of like maybe unpack that a little bit, because I think it's an interesting concept in as much as you can't cheat and no one can do it for you. And there's no faking it, right? And I think that is truth. That is truth. It's funny, you talk about truth and it's like my brain's going crazy of like, how do I define truth? What is truth? Which is not, maybe a conversation for another time, but yeah, what are your thoughts on health as proof of work?
Well, I mean, you could say truth is what fosters maximum integration between all disparate patterns of existence, something like that. The thing that makes everything click or integrate most optimally. But we maybe we come back to that one. Before I address the question, I want to touch on a few of the things you said. Like, one, you mentioned having a positive impact in life, and I think that's a fine aspiration. But I also like, because I've been, for a long time, I guess, wrestling with this concept of like right action. Like you can intellectually understand a lot of things. You can read a book on philosophy or theology or mystical treatise or whatever, and you can think like, I get that. That makes sense to me. That lines up with how I think. But how does that process of transmutation from insight to action take place, and how should it take place, and how should you constitute it? And back to that, what I was saying about like those potentially fundamental constituents of our experience of reality, and again, that might take some unpacking itself, but just for the sake of this little tangent, we'll just leave it for now and say, like, it seems to me to be the case that if you can allow those things to orient you, like if you can, and I think subordinate is a good word to use here, because basically you're taking the ego separate identified self and saying, rather than making that the end to which all of my efforts are directed, like that thing accruing things, it seems to be more rational and ultimately better for it to be the case that the primary end to which my actions are oriented are being of service to those principles or values or ideals that are truth, freedom, love, beauty. And again, perhaps there are more, and maybe we can explore that. And so it almost seems to me that if the primary aim should be to do that, because what results from that will be the most positive impact that you could have, if the assumption about those being fundamental in some way is accurate. And again, I guess my underlying position at the moment is that that is the case. And so, I'm not opposed to like doing intentional and specific positive actions, and in many cases they may actually cohere with something like love, subordinating yourself to love. So they may be the same in some sense, but I think my highest aim is not to have like a positive impact in the way that we might conceptualize it in modern culture today. Like, you're doing a lot of good stuff for a lot of people. It's properly orienting yourself by and to those values, and then allowing the action allowing action to flow naturally from them, and knowing that that's the best impact that you could possibly have, like the actions that result from doing that. And then I wanted to touch on something that you said about our relationship to ourselves. And of course, I agree that, we're our own worst enemy in many cases, and we create cages of our own making a lot of the time, even as fucked up as the world is. And, we're a lot of the things that we're trying to rectify through Bitcoin and that kind of jazz. Like, the reality is even though the world's not perfect, like, most people can do a lot more for themselves than they are doing, but they impose artificial restrictions on themselves and artificial stressors and all that kind of stuff, myself included. I'm not speaking from the point of view of having transcended all of this.
And at certain periods of time, those are probably constructive, right? Like, we do it for a reason.
Yeah, sure.
And we just forget to take them down once the reason no longer exists.
Right. And that's the trick of mediation, right? Like, when to float in and out of a certain mode of being. And I actually think this is one of the things that characterizes, in my mind, the concept of like a spiritual master is not like, oh, wow, he meditates for 12 hours a day in a ashram in India. It's that, I think in my mind, a spiritual master is someone who's most capable of embodying the most appropriate version of themselves for whatever moment or environment they find themselves in. And, again, to oversimplify that, I would say like an easy example would be, if you find yourself in a fight, are you like, let's put it this way. A lot of people, for reasons of comfort and fear and conditioning and habit and all this kind of stuff, they end up having a singular rigid identity, right? And so my identity in this situation reacts this way, and in that situation reacts this way, and in that situation reacts this way.
A script.
Right. But I think because we're so fluid, and because we can embody so many different frames of mind or perspectives as human beings, it seems to me that like a real master is the one that, based on the circumstance, can embody the aspect of themselves that's most optimized for handling that experience in the best possible way. And so if you need to show up and be like, a ferocious fighter in one moment, because that's what the moment calls for, being able to fully embody that without any distracting aspects of yourself, and then move right in, or not right in, but like, and then have the capacity to move into, the most compassionate, empathetic, understanding aspect of yourself when you're confronted with, I don't know, a child who's just lost a parent and is in that kind of situation, and then who is on stage in front of 1,000 people and is attempting to articulate their life philosophy to them, and being able to enter into that aspect of themselves without any interrupting thoughts or other aspects. You know what I mean? So someone who can,
like, adaptable.
Yeah, like someone who really has the capacity to optimally adapt to any circumstance that they might enter into. So, I think that is a great definition of spiritual mastery, not, someone who wears a robe or meditates or anything like that.
I guess my question with that, because the first thing that came to mind when you were talking about that is like a chameleon, right? They're adaptable to whatever situation.
You're right.
And
sometimes, to just a funny anecdote, like, because this is something I try to establish in my own life, or become a person that's capable or maximally capable of that, sometimes I say like as a pejorative, I'm like, because it can feel maybe because of our conditioning, it can feel artificial. Like, am I just a phony, right? I show up differently in every place.
Right. That was my question. How do you maintain you, right? And I think the sequence I went through was like, well, if you have those supreme aspirations, like you mentioned, truth, love, beauty, health for me is a big one. If you maintain that, that's what allows you to be adaptable. It's almost like you keep what's important to guide you, but you shed all of the superficial things that allow you to adapt to the situation, right? Like, it's like, because you still need some sort of anchor, right? Otherwise, you're just literally going through the whims based on the world around you and letting the world tell you how you should be. But I think the key element there is like, as long as you are pointed towards those virtues and keep them hierarchically as a priority through all your actions, then you have a broad array of actions that you're capable of, but you maintain the core, right? The core is unwavering. But all of the layers that people often adopt as rigid, you are able to transcend because you have such clarity of the core. And I think clarity is the most important thing, right? Like, how do I act in this situation? Well, like literally this happened to me during my involvement in the convoy, where like the world was caving in around me. And I said, okay, I just have to double down on my values of love, integrity, honor, and respect. If every single one of my actions revolves around that, then I don't have to make a judgment on every single action. I don't have to evaluate every single one, because there were so many things to evaluate. And I knew that if I just did that, whatever the action was, if it was guided by that core, it would work out well. So yeah, thank you for putting it in those words.
I think that's the idea of liberation, right? When your actions are so subordinated, in fact, to use more narrative language, when you sacrifice yourself to those virtues such that you're going to sacrifice your time and your energy and your attention toward them, that liberates you from the concerns of, oh, was that the right thing at the right time to do this? Was the outcome what I wanted it to be? All that kind of stuff. And I keep saying, I'm making this comment, and maybe I'll stop because it's probably getting annoying, but like this concept shows up so much in ancient literature by people who have grappled with these ideas before, because if you can conform to those things that are, let's say, maximally true and good, then you're liberated from the incessant interrupting or intervening aspects of yourself that cuts you off from those things. And then again, you just like, and you're set free in a sense. And you mentioned, a few minutes ago, why people are so, hard on themselves is conditioning plays such a big part of it. And it really does, obviously, and I often use an oversimplified example, but to say that if you or I were born not in Canada, but in the Amazon basin, like, we would be very different people. We would have different preferences, and we would like different things, and we would think different types of women are attractive, and all the rest of it. Like, all of our preferences would be different. And so, but it begs the question that you just asked, like, well, who are you? Like, if you're moving, and back to the point you made about like the chameleon, it's like, well, if you're moving through all these things, like, yeah, who are you? But I totally agree with how your comments on it was like, if you have that solid core, and that's been the core you've been refining your whole life. It's almost like the more you can refine that core, the more clarity you can get around that, the more almost faith you can have that is the most true, then that is what sets you free to be what's most appropriate in every situation, right? To embody that core in its various aspects in every situation based on the needs of the circumstance or the environment or the situation. But the fact is that most people, because of conditioning and deprivation and fear and so many other things, they construct a singular identity that they think is most secure and operable for a very specific and narrow anticipated or expected or desired course of life. And they stick to it for all those reasons, because it's so terribly uncomfortable when that veil is first pierced. And this is one of the prime benefits, I would say, prime, one of the initial benefits of psychedelics is that it can help you, it can transpose you temporarily into an entirely different perspective that doesn't identify with all the different things that you've used, all the different associations to construct your own identity. And so it delivers to you a perspective that is unconditioned versus the conditioned one that you've built up over the course of your entire life. And it can be terrifying because all of those things from the time you're a baby to the time you're 40, they're constructed basically to generate psychological security for you so that you can get through the chaos of existence and of life, without falling into pieces, right? Without breaking into pieces. And so there's a utility of it, but you have to, I think it's incredibly beneficial to not let it become you, to just realize the utility of it. And as we've been saying, lean into it as and when is necessary. And, this idea of ego death obviously is very commonly reported in psychedelic literature. And that's basically what's happening is the conditioning is stripped away, the identity is stripped away, and people feel, and the reason why it's so terrifying initially is because people feel so naked. It's like,
right.
And
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, this was my experience the first time it happened to me. I mean, you're literally there in this frame of consciousness that you've never inhabited before, and you're saying to yourself, who am I? Like, what am I? I don't even have a solid enough conception of myself to have a point of reference to ask that question. Even I'm not even there, and it's terrifying. It's terrifying,
but also
and
liberating.
If you can, well,
if you frame liberation
it like that. The liberation comes later, right? If you have the courage to stay with that and to pursue that and to push through the terrifying aspect of it, what I think you find is that what lies on the other end of that is a profound liberation. And, speaking in terms of the experience itself, I think, a lot of people report connecting to that, united or eternal energy or source that we were referring to earlier. But then you come down and you come back down into your more identified ego self, and you reflect on the experience and you try to integrate it and all that kind of stuff. And what I think happens is, for a lot of people, even though you go back into the individuated form or self, you now have an appreciation that there is another perspective available to you, that there is another component to you, that, all these different things that you use to hold yourself in attention in order to engage the world are not necessarily real, and they're not necessarily permanent. And you can maneuver them and you can refine them more than you might have thought before. And I think that experience, as terrifying as it may initially be, grants people it motivates them and inspires them to relieve the rigidity of the grip that their identity holds on them, such that they may become something, for lack of a better term, far better, far more integrated, far more truthful, ultimately.
Yeah, someone made a great analogy to me one time. They said, in order to change your clothes, you got to be naked at some point. And it's like the whole notion that great. we wear, the clothing is all of our programming and what we think the world wants of us often. And it gives us a sense of safety, right? Like, it lets us be a human and not be scared that people will judge us. We're wearing the clothes that, the culture seems to want me to wear. And the courage to be naked at some point gives you the optionality to pick a new wardrobe. And, the fear of being naked limits people from being able to realize their more actualized self, right? It's like you go, like psilocybin. I had this experience one time where, like, I almost got a vision of me sitting in a box, and then psilocybin basically dropped the edges of the box and freaked the shit out of me, because I was like, everything I thought was true is no longer true. So you have two options there. You can either run for the hills and just wither in your fear, or you can say, well, the world's a lot bigger than I thought, and I have a lot more to learn. And now at least I know that what I was confining myself to is not the limit through which I can explore. It doesn't mean I know what to do or where to go, but I just know, like, a truth was revealed to me. And now it's up to me to put the work in to make sense of that truth and see how it reorients my view on life and what I do with my time. And I think the whole notion that, the hermit crab, as you grow, as the hermit crab grows, it must seek a larger shell. If it doesn't, it gets constricted and suffocated by the current one. But to make it to another shell, you have to go without protection for a certain period of time. And I think when people develop the courage to do that, despite it being scary, it always results in a broader perspective. And one thing I wanted to ask you about, and something I'm thinking about a lot these days, because now I'm sort of, especially with family, I'm really starting to tune into the language people use when I have health conversations with them. The language they use has so much of an impact to tell me of like how they think of health, right? And what I've started to parse, and it's like once I saw this, I couldn't unsee it, is this whole notion that when it comes to health, it seems like people have one of two views. They are either the hero of their health story or they are the victim of their health story. And it's my observation that they are mutually exclusive. You'll have stronger victim or hero tendencies within a health story, but the language people use, like, I got a bad back. My back is bad. I can't do anything about it, right? I got a bad back versus right now my back is a bit sore. I'm figuring out how to get rid of it. Like the subtlest, and I used to be a physical therapist, so I wish I would have had this perspective when I was working with people, because I would have probably seen it way more blatantly. But just like with life, we are the author of our story. And I really think health is the ultimate hero's journey, because it is like, it's hard in a world that revolves around disease, which I think is a derivative of the money we use, to be quite frank. But what are your thoughts on this notion that everyone must decide whether they are the hero of their health story or the victim? And I think we all started out as victims, because my programming, even in physio school, was that people's bodies are shit. It's my job to get people out of pain when they inevitably develop pain. But the story I started to develop when I was treating was that actually our bodies are insanely advanced, like literally so advanced that we take them for granted. I kind of wish it broke down as soon as we started not treating it right, because people would tune in a lot more. But this whole flip of the body went from something that is doomed to break down, my job is to help people reduce their symptoms when they have them, to the body is an insanely advanced piece of equipment, and all we have to do is figure out what we're doing to fuck it up and stop doing that. That was a radical mindset shift in how I go about helping people with health, because I don't tell them what to do anymore. I just point them in the right direction to do the experiments they need to do to expand their understanding. So, it almost seemed like the day you said, will you buy me this lighter if I don't eat junk food for a month, was when you went from victim to hero, it seems. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with that. I think, as you were saying that, the thought that came to my mind the most is that I think the thing that will determine which one of those attitudes you take is the meaning of the aim, right? And so, like, at that moment where it was the lighter thing, like, the meaning of the aim was the lighter, and that was sufficient to motivate the work. And then as this journey has progressed, I mean, again, as we've been discussing, like, the aim is now some sort of spiritual aim, right? We've been discussing these, orienting our perspective around the highest values that at least, or principles or virtues that at least we can ascertain. And by virtue of the fact that when you do that, reality seems to output something beneficial. It seems like doing, like, those values or principles cohere with something unseen and unknowable about this reality that we experience, and so pursuing the means of optimally establishing a relationship with those aspects of the grander, structure of reality, as it were, is a pretty high aim as far as I can tell. And so that seems to be more than sufficient motivation for the work required to pursue that aim. But I think, it seems, I don't think it's controversial to say that in the world today, there seems to be somewhat of a meaning crisis happening. And, someone who I recently spoke to on my podcast, John Vallis, has done a wonderful 50-part series on YouTube about that. And he's just a
I've
brilliant
watched some of it.
guy in
It's
general.
powerful.
Yeah.
It takes a while to
Yeah.
digest.
Yeah. I mean, his familiarity with like anyone who's ever written anything interesting about philosophy or theology or meaning is just mind blowing, you know? But yeah, I mean, I think that's the case, right? I mean, you know, God is dead, right? Nietzsche's famous phrase, and we seem to be in a more secular, materialistic sort of paradigm prevailing in the world today, even amongst those that claim to be religious, if I can get away with saying something like that. And I think that probably is causing a lot of problems, but maybe none greater than the meaning crisis, is that people find themselves in a world where they have more knowledge about the material workings of the world than ever, and more access to the wonders of the world and the conveniences of the world, but they seem fairly cut off from the thing that makes the thing that makes the material world worth engaging, let's say.
That's a good point.
And I think a lot of people, if we're just focusing on this, you know, health aspect, which again, as we've been discussing, is like perhaps there's nothing but that, right? Even though it's more narrowly defined in culture, like in culture, we've been defining it in fairly broad terms and fairly fundamental terms. But I think if you don't have a higher meaningful aim, right? If you haven't been able to construct that, then why wouldn't you default to the victim? You know, because everything is difficult, and overcoming an injury or lethargy or time or stress or horrible circumstances requires your effort and attention. And I mean, it just seems to be the case that there's insufficient motivation for a lot of people to do that. And I think that's being reflected and represented in how, like, what people look like in the world today. And I don't just mean their physical form, but like what their whole composition of their life looks like. It seems to be fairly representative of lacking at least the highest meaning that might be available to us as human beings. Like, certainly most people have some meaning in their life, you know, be it children or artistic endeavors, or, you know, like, and children is obviously a fairly high one, and thank God for that, because maybe that's why, like, you know, the world hasn't descended into complete meaninglessness, because at least that still remains, right. Even if the notion of God, you know, is not so popular in the current era. But so I think it's about that. I mean, I think it's if the aim, and even if you have, like, even if kids are entirely meaningful to you, let's take this, you know, someone who's in their 60s now and the kids have long left the home, like, their health doesn't really amplify the aim of having a strong relationship with your children at this point, unless maybe you came from like a super fit family and you always do activities together, and then it's probably the case that you've maintained your fitness so you can still do the family activities with them. So, like, I think for a lot of those people that take the victim track on that dichotomy or dynamic, it's because there's insufficient motivation to move towards a meaningful aim.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one of the biggest things I ask people, if someone wants to improve the state of their health and is authentically curious to take action, ready to take action, one of the first things I ask is like, what's your motivation? Why are you doing this? And when I was a physical therapist, I saw one interaction made this land so hard for me. I had this, like, she was in her mid 80s, very mobile for her age, right? I'm used to seeing like people in their 50s that are incapacitated now because they just sit all day. And she had this one little issue with her knee and she wanted to get rid of it. And I said, you know, it's going to, like, when you come in to see me, this is not where the work happens. We troubleshoot to determine what you're going to do in your life to fix this. So, like, why are you doing this? And she did not skip a beat. She said, I want to play with my grandkids on the floor. And I never want to be a burden to my family. She spat that out, right? Like, she didn't even have to think about it. It wasn't even, and she only saw me like 3 or 4 times, and I never had to see her again. And she did everything she was supposed to. And she took full radical ownership of her shit. And she knew that there was a lot at stake. And it's like, the less of a deeply rooted motivation that you align with in your soul to help you enhance your health, the more discipline you need. right? It's like what you lack in meaning, you must make up for in discipline.
Yeah.
And
it's a losing battle.
And it is, because discipline, there's no, there's just, it's so energetically intensive to force yourself to do something that you don't fully align with your whole being. And so I think people just need to, the work with health often is like, what meaning do you have out of this? This process will require work. It will be difficult. You must have enough meaning to over the hardest challenge you face. Your motivation must be higher than that hardest challenge. Right. Otherwise, that can be what is your insurmountable obstacle. And the people who I know who it's funny, like the people who are the healthiest, on all fronts, spiritually, mentally, physically, when I have conversations about health, they really don't have a whole lot to say, because they're like, I'm just living my life. And it's almost like the living a life of purpose allowed health to be a byproduct. It allowed health to not even need to be a focus. Maybe it comes into focus at periods where health is starting to escape you, and you feel the physical or mental ramifications of that. But it's almost like the people with a deeply rooted sense of meaning and purpose in life don't have to think about health, because health is simply a symptom of what is going on.
Yeah. And I think this speaks to the like overweighted materialistic view that prevails in large part today, is to say, like, health means my body is fit and strong, and I'm promoting longevity. That's what health means. Whereas we've been discussing this whole time, and to the point you were just making, like, no, health is your experience of life. And perhaps no greater component of that than your source of meaning, what drives you to even do anything ever. And if you lack that, then no amount of time on the treadmill or personal trainers or anything like that is going to deliver to you what you're seeking. Right. And again, I do think we exist in a time where there's a meaning crisis, but how many people are willing to go to their personal trainer, psychotherapist, physiotherapist, and when they ask, like, well, what are you doing this for, say, I don't really, like, nothing, who cares,
I don't want pain,
like,
that's it.
Yeah. And it's like, if that were true, because people say, well, I just don't want to have back pain anymore. It's like, well, yeah, fair enough, of course you wouldn't, but like, what does the word want mean? Does it mean it's something I want delivered to me absent the requisite, like, work or effort to achieve it? Because I like that just seems like a wish, not a want. If you're going to tell me that you want something, it means by default that it's something that you're willing to engage the effort and work in order to achieve. But I think it's like it's almost like a spiritual Rubicon that people just have a very hard time crossing, to say to themselves more than anybody, the reason why I don't do all of these things that, like, I at least recognize would be ideal if I was doing them, and if I could just tick a box to have them delivered to me or wish for them, I would wish for them. It's because I lack sufficient meaning in order to devote myself to them. And how many people want to admit that? Nobody. Because once you cross that Rubicon, once you admit that your life is bereft of sufficient meaning to pursue it, then what are you doing? And I think the answer is evident all over our, as we like to say in Bitcoin, fiat culture today, where in order to deflect or ignore the uncomfortable answer to that question, we fill it up with distractions of various kinds, be it food, entertainment, stresses of life, like anything. Give me anything but confronting that question, because I'm not ready to admit to myself what the answer is, and I'm too scared to embark on that journey.
Yeah, and sometimes, I've known a lot of people who require a catastrophic event in their health in order to refocus on what actually matters. Right? Like they need that because they have not experienced enough mental, physical, spiritual pain to push them off the cliff to change. Because change is hard. So right now, the suffering I'm experiencing isn't bad enough that I'm looking at the potential for change at a deep level. And, this whole idea of I just don't want back pain and people not really doing anything, I think that is a derivative of this, once again, victim mindset. Like, it doesn't matter what I do. Every time I work on this, the back pain comes back. Nothing I can do works. So why bother doing anything? Just give me the pill, right? And the unfortunate reality is, like, I also know a lot of doctors and I love them all and they're all amazing humans. But when you work within this system that is fundamentally disempowering, whereby you have a problem, I get paid to pretend like I'm solving the problem for you, is fundamentally disempowering, because it says, in order to solve this problem, you must come to me. Like, it's a straight up proof of stake. My stake is that I have this piece of paper that says I know the thing, and you must come to me to solve your problem because you are not capable of solving your problem. And I'm only capable of solving the symptom. I'm not even solving the problem, because if I solve the problem, I stop getting paid. It's super fucked up. So this whole fiat, this world of centralized medicine, and I think also medicine is fundamentally different than health, right? And we often conflate the two. Oh, we have a healthcare system. We don't have a healthcare system. We have a disease care system that is predicated on never solving the problems because it exhausts it of its revenue sources. And until we get rid of high time preference, fiat money, and the foundation that creates for all business endeavors within the world of health, or really just sick care management, very hard to make any meaningful progress with health. Like, the reason that I stopped working in health as my primary outlet and started working in Bitcoin was this. I had this realization at the start of this year. This mental model I use now is called the layer cake, where it's money, governance, education, health. And each layer is hierarchically derived from the layer below it. So I'm working at the top superficial layer, right? And I like the dichotomy of lowercase h, health, is health of the individual. Uppercase H, health, is health of the individual, the collective, and of the planet, right? So I used to write health and climate, but capital H, health, is like health of the people, of the collective, and of the environment. They're all kind of like, healthy people take care of their home. And this whole notion that, okay, we're working really hard to convince the luckiest people in the world, in North America, to take care of themselves, when in reality, health is a derivative of education. If you know how to take care of yourself, then you can work towards health. And if you know what matters, then you can at least hopefully adopt health as a meaningful cause to put your energy and time towards. Health, education, governance. The people in governance determine what education we get. And money determines people who get into governance. So if the bottom layer in that layer cake is fundamentally flawed and creates a set of perverse incentives that permeate the whole stack, there's no point in working on health with broken money. And in fact, solving broken money creates a whole different incentive structure that by default, health will be a symptom if we fix that problem. And it's like, we love that trope. Bitcoin fix the money, fix the world. And I love what Michael Saylor says, where he's like, it might not fix everything, but it fixes at least half the problems. And, to me, I was like, well, once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. So clearly working on Bitcoin is a more important and pressing, element than health. And I actually think working on Bitcoin to me really just means, the reason I loved working on health is because it really means taking a complex and making it simple and actionable for people. I think spreading Bitcoin really is the same thing, taking the complex, making it simple, actionable, so that people feel empowered to approach this process, right? Like, health is a process, understanding Bitcoin, process. Takes a long time, has to be low time preference. And yeah.
Well, like it's to that layer cake structure you were just explaining, as we've been discussing this whole time, I mean, it's really just optimizing the experience of life all the way down, and as what we've been saying about integration, right? Like, and how all these pieces fit together most optimally. But the kicker there is what that optimization looks like is necessarily defined by the aim, obviously. And that's what we've been discussing a lot as well. And this is why I think, like, when we talk about integration and we talk about optimization, all this stuff, we have to look toward the aim. And this is why these philosophical and theological discussions are so appealing to me and important, because that's the source of the why. That's the source of the aim. That's the source of the meaning, which will dictate all the optimization downstream of that. And what I'm super excited about, with a truthful form of money like Bitcoin, is that I think that coheres more so than any other money we've ever had, and more so, and perhaps even more so than any idea we've ever had, with those fundamental principles that we've been discussing: truth, freedom, connectedness, and another a synonym for connectedness you might use love. And so it's very interesting that, well, I think it's a representation of those things, but the broader point is that, like, we're all of this optimization. The whole point is just optimize the experience of life. Okay,
Yes.
what do we need to do that? We need to know what the most meaningful aim is. And we've really gone off course, it seems to me, as a species on this earth, in having clarity around that. And one of the things that I think Bitcoin is going to bring back through a variety of ways, not just by how it removes a lot of the detritus or distortion of information from this massive global organism that's communicating and trying to find value in its relationships to one another. But as I have written a little bit about, I think it may also be kind of like an archetypal representation of the value that accrues to those very principles when they're most represented in the world. So whether we are representations in our actions of being maximally truthful, pursuing maximal liberation from the things that cut us off from ourselves and from other people, and pursuing a maximal absorption or subordination to the idea of love, for example, I think that accrues value to ourselves. Like, that perhaps is the highest value or experience of a perception or a perspective that we can have. And it seems to me that Bitcoin is accruing value so rapidly because it is the highest fidelity representation of those very principles or values in the interpersonal world, let's say. And that's a wild notion, because that representation has been characterized in a variety of myths and stories and narratives, religious and otherwise, throughout time, as the central cultural hero. The one that our society is most familiar with is Jesus, right? It's the transmutation of those principles into form. In the case of narrative, it's the transmutation of those principles into a character who's representative of what it looks like to be an embodiment of those virtues or principles, and how they might act, and how we might learn and follow that action, let's say. I think it might be the case, and this is like the time in the chat when I throw down my far out, cosmic comment, but it might be the case that Bitcoin is a literal, real world instantiation of what it looks like when those principles are represented in their most pristine form. And the good that Bitcoin is doing, and the value that it's attracting, and the ways in which it's changing all of us, which it is obviously dramatically doing for many of us, is reflective of the power of those ideas being so represented in the not only conceptual, but in the quote unquote physical, the interpersonally tangible world. And who the hell knows what the result of that is ultimately going to be, because if any of that is even remotely true, it's a fairly momentous event, to say the least. So,
dude,
yeah,
it's like a mic drop moment. Because it really is like, and obviously everyone has their own subjective experience of life, but that old saying where, like, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you, I think is a reflection that Bitcoin is like this magnet, and it seems to, the gravitation of this magnet seems to be a great aligner for people, like to really bring things into an aligned stack, being the embodiment of a set of values without even, like, Bitcoin culture is its own thing, and it's many things, and there's many subcultures within Bitcoin. But if you ask someone what are the common threads of Bitcoin culture, they often say similar things, right? Like truth, freedom, honesty, these things. And once it's almost like by default, whether you realize it or not, the values you adopt in your life end up being an approximation of the values embodied in the medium of communication you use. And with value, that's money. So the values, the fucked up values of the fiat world, have permeated into individuals by default. Because if you use a form of money, and you want to avoid the cognitive dissonance of admitting that that money has a fucked up set of values, then you automatically will gravitate towards the values of that money and react to the incentives that that money creates. And this whole notion that like the longer someone learns about and acquires and understands Bitcoin, the more their life view and their value structure starts to kind of like just align to fit in parallel with Bitcoin, is like, it's this magical thing that it's so hard to explain, which is why I think the conversations you have, the writing that you do from an extremely, I would even say it's, spiritual level of zooming out to really focus on what truly matters. Okay, it's like onions. Like you go right to the core of the onion and it can seem abstract because no one's gone down to that depth before, but that's really the conversation that needs to be had to put what is happening on the periphery into context and be like, oh, okay, well, based on that, this makes more sense now. I was focusing on like the outer layer of the onion, but when you get down to the core, it's easy to see how the outer layers develop based on that core. And it's a magical thing. It's like, what a fucking time to be alive, dude. It's crazy in the grand scheme.
It's incredible. But, you mentioned earlier about how the language we use can reveal things about how we're thinking and our perspective and stuff. And you used the term that like, I see things through the Bitcoin lens now. Well, what if I see things through the Christ lens? Is that not, basically being a follower of that kind? And is it not basically recognizing the representation of certain principles within that lens and wanting to adopt it for myself because of the benefit that I believe will be derived from doing so? And so, I think that's what's happening for a lot of people. I think that's a process that's underway. And a while back you asked about proof of work, and we never really came back to it, but like the whole, like when we talk about, well, actually, I'll pause that and I'll say, like, you were also saying that money is a reflection of those values. And I very much agree. Like every action we take is a reflection of the values or principles that inform that action, right? That constitute kind of our will. And money is the means of basically pushing our will out into the world, having our actions kind of reverberate further afield than just our own physical domain. Like if I pay you to do something, then I'm temporarily pushing my will through you and you're agreeing to it for a variety of reasons. But the point is that the values that animate the action that I'm choosing or the action that I'm attempting to push through you will be are reflected, right? So like if I go out on the street and punch some dude in the head, like there's certain principles wrapped up in that action that we could tease out. Likewise, if, other actions would be emblematic or reflect, or we would be able to tease out higher principles and values like the ones we've been discussing. And money is a means of transmitting them further and wider than previously possible. And what makes Bitcoin so interesting is not only that as a system itself, it reflects those values, but it's also a pristine carrier of those values. Because as you were saying, there's no exogenous information in those signals that's perverting or distorting the signal, i.e. someone else's will through the creation or expansion of the supply, or through the friction that might be caused from intermediaries of various kinds. Like it is pure action derived signal of values and principles that animated or that fostered or that inspired that action. And so we were saying before about how the anecdote of the grandmother who kind of was a vessel for love, and it was represented in her children and grandchildren. I mean, it's very much a similar process whereby the principles that you now express through your market action, i.e. the way you spend money, will be represented and reverberate through the market as a result of that. And one of the reasons why I get so excited about what's going to be revealed as we further move into a Bitcoin denominated world is when all of our relationships are constituted on those terms, and what each of us really, who we really are, not who we say we are, and not how other people distort our expression of who we are, but who we actually really are based on our behavior. is going to be able to be transmitted. And that's the basis on which we're going to be able to compare things and determine truth and interact with one another and develop relationships and determine what is most meaningful and what is most beautiful and all of these things. And that's the best you can hope for. Then it's just up to us to try to, you know, extrapolate from ourselves, like all these things that we've been talking about, what is health, that optimized experience of life, sharing that and integrating that with the broader collective and seeing what can be built up or what manifests as a result of doing it on those terms. And if you fundamentally believe that people and reality or the universe or God or whatever word you have for it is good, and I think that is a fundamental belief of mine, then you should be very excited by the prospect that it is going to be more ably, it now has a, let's say, a bigger door to emerge into the world. And that's very exciting.
Yeah. It's like Bitcoin is now a previously inaccessible portal for humans to actualize to their highest potential. Mm-hmm. And without that, we've always had a artificially imposed limitation in how much human flourishing can actually occur on Earth. And not only that, but it's this revolving incentive of continuing to push the boundary of what we thought was possible. Yeah, it's so,
that's the way it seems.
It's hard to sit in it sometimes where it's like, oh my God, this is like, it's like, I think you said it, it's like the more you learn about Bitcoin, the more you realize how much more there is to learn and how much more impactful it is than even what you thought, which you thought was the limit of impact.
It's like, yeah, I can't remember, like in maybe my pothead days, like, you know, early teens, I can't, you know, you watch all those like famous pothead movies. I can't remember which one it was, but like one of the guys turns to the other one. It's like, I think you just blew my fucking mind, you know? And I feel like the more I think about and write about in these concepts, like, you know, maybe that's a bit extreme, but like these fairly profound insights seem to be increasing in frequency as this path is pursued around trying to understand the implications of Bitcoin and how it connects with all these other meaningful areas of our lives. Like it's pretty much a daily thing, you know, you just be out for a run or out for a swim and it'll like strike you and you'll be like, whoa, like I never saw it that way before. But you asked about proof of work a while back and I said I'd come back to it. So just to put a capstone on that one, I think it's the interesting analogy, as far as I can tell, or the most interesting analogy, not analogy, similarity perhaps, is that when we do anything, when we act, every act is a sacrifice, right? Because we have limited time, we have limited energy resources, and we have limited attention, right? The opportunity cost of doing one thing is literally everything else that you could possibly do in that moment. Yes. And so every action we take is sacrificing, but sacrificing to what? And the answer is it's sacrificing to the aim of the action, or it's sacrificing to, pursuing the aim or representing the value inherent in the action. And so, and this is somewhat repetitive of what we've been saying, but I think it's interesting that the mechanics of value is like you sacrifice and you get something of value in return. Okay, well then if we take that to the extremes, it's like, what is the ultimate sacrifice I can make to receive the ultimate value in return? And it seems to me that this is basically the underlying mechanics or structure of religious narrative. That's what it's trying to kind of convey and saying like, and they use that language. And I think unfortunately, because we're in such a maybe literal or material era, or maybe this has kind of always been the case, because I think you do have to understand these at a fairly deep level to see it this way. And also maybe I'm wrong, but I think most people take the literal meanings of so many of these, various religious and spiritual texts throughout time and maybe fail to see the deeper meaning. But to me, what it means is that you determine, basically you give as much as yourself that is possible. You determine the thing that's worthy of giving as much of yourself as possible to it. And as a result of that, you gain the maximum, like that thing in its highest form. And so even if we kind of use the religious take on this, and if we, instead of using it as like I sacrifice myself, as in I martyr myself and I, am absorbed into God as a result, if we kind of take it down a level to the language we've been using, it's saying, how can I maximally subordinate myself to the highest values that I can conceive of, as we've been discussing: truth, freedom, love, beauty, goodness, what have you. And so it seems to me that proof of work is just that, the mechanics of that. It's saying, if you sacrifice some time, some energy, whatever, to a certain end, you will be rewarded for that. And the reason why Bitcoin seems to be operating in this somewhat like of an archetypal capacity is because it's sacrificing like the primary constituent of existence almost, which is energy, toward establishing an incorruptible form of truth, which grants liberation to those who avail of it, and which constitutes a network of relationships that are not disintermediated by anything. And if we go all the way back to what we were saying before about like that ego self versus like eternal united self, like, a definition that I sometimes use for love is, and like a non-romantic love, is the recognition of a lack of separation between all people and potentially all things. And so that's the type of network that is constituted via an incorruptible truth. And so you have again in Bitcoin the archetypal representation of the mechanics of value itself in the physical world, which is you sacrifice the most fundamental thing there is to be sacrificed, which is energy, toward the end of truth and, let's say, love, in terms of the connections that it generates. And should we be surprised that people are seeing it and being profoundly impacted by it? Because this seems to be the mechanics of value taken toward its maximal conceptual ends, and done so out in the physical world. And we might say that if it was a purely non-interpersonal conceptual, if we were conceiving of that in a purely individual and non-interpersonal way, we might characterize that as the religious or theological or spiritual mechanics of value of, I'm going to completely subordinate myself to being a vessel for those higher principles, ideals, or values, which we've been discussing. But in the interpersonal world, in the cultural world, let's say, or in the not exclusively conceptual, what would that relationship look like? Or like, what would that system or those mechanics look like? And, again, this is a wild statement, but it seems, at least current thinking is that it seems like it would look a lot like what Bitcoin looks like.
Yeah, I would agree.
I don't know if that one came out super clear, but
yeah, no. I'll have to listen to it again to let it really marinate, because I was kind of thinking of what the fuck am I going to say after he's done this. But I really think, this, I don't know, my mind is really spotlighting on this notion of truth, where like I consider health someone who has lived in true alignment with their biology. And this notion that the aspiration is truth, right? We want to know, how does the world, instead of seeing the world as we are, see the world as it is, right? And reality, seeing reality as it is instead of as we are, that the process of trying to approximate that is the quest for truth, right? And this notion that life is a quest for truth has so many different applications, right? Whereas health is the quest, within the context of health being living in true alignment with your biology, and even on an outer ring, living in true alignment with the will of the universe, or with fate, then the work you put in is with the aspiration of truth. And, with Bitcoin, the work you put in for someone to compensate you is like, truth money must underlie a society that wishes to approach truth. That's what came out of that for me.
Sure.
And the whole idea that for the first time ever, we have truthful money that is incorruptible, that actually can be a true emblem of can be an accurate emblem of truth, uh, means that our entire notion of what life is and how life works and how we operate individually and collectively is going to be completely recalibrated, and so much better to a better world, to a world built on truth is a better world, and is a healthier world, is a more meaningful world, because all of a sudden you can ascribe meaning to things that you know are true, not because someone said they were true. And once you find out they're not true, then it's like, well, I can't find out the truth because I keep listening to all these things and none of them end up being true. So
I think there's a certain faith in that, though, which is why we might not be able to dispense with that thing, as repugnant as it's become to modern culture. Because if you say that, like, that is one of the highest aims, and that, lives will be better and culture and civilization would be better if we're oriented around and have the means of communicating and interacting on the basis of truth, it seems to me that a fundamental proposition there is that what's true is good. And that seems faith-based to me. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way whatsoever. I mean, I said earlier that I think that has to be an underlying aspect of my worldview, is that if I'm pursuing truth as the highest, well, good, then there has to be an assumption that it's good to do that. And
right.
if true is like, if part of the definition of true is how things are, and I understand that, like, it's difficult to nail down objective truth, because, like, we're not just observing the world, we're a part of it. There's a lot wrapped up there. But again, like, if we're just going with the approach that what's true is good, I think we have to have a faith that what is good, and pursuing a as great an understanding of what is as possible, including ourselves, including the world, including one another, is good. Then that, I think that has to mean that we're making a commentary on the isness itself, and that it is somehow good, and it somehow leans toward good and desires good. Now, and I think, that's obviously been represented in a lot of the writings of the past. Now, perhaps, unfortunately, the tools and the culture and the conceptual frameworks that were available to them at the time have led those ideas to being misrepresented in subsequent times, or, again, as we've been saying, overly literally interpreted, and that kind of thing. So a lot of people today would, soundly dismiss the notion of, a white bearded guy in the sky that has come to be known as God, and, perhaps for good reason in that form. But if you strip away a lot of the cultural language used to communicate those ideas, and you just try to get to what's underlying them, well, in that case, I think there's a lot more, they have a lot more credibility than the current culture seems to be giving them credit for, or recognizing. And it seems like it's something like that. It's something like that. The thing, the isness, another one of the things in the psychedelic experience, when the self dissolves, and you're trying to conceptualize what you're in the presence of and simultaneously connected to. Like, one of the terms that often comes up is, like, it is itself, which makes no sense, but it's like, it's the only way you can find the words to articulate what you're currently experiencing. And if you I think, if you're going to orient yourself in the way that we've been articulating, the itself, that whatever that thing is that we're referring to when we're trying to put words on it, I think we have to ascribe goodness and a desire for goodness, or like an intent for goodness, to it. And then, all the stories that get built on top of that try to convey that in various ways. And maybe they don't do such a good job, or maybe they do, because some of them are fairly sticky and they've stuck around for a long time. But that's one of the things that I find really interesting about what's happening today. A lot of Bitcoiners have been appreciating, let's say, the insight and the wisdom contained in Christianity. And so a lot of people have been going back to that faith, or like where their family they grew up in it perhaps, and going back to it, or for the first time. And I think that's amazing, because people are finding an avenue for determining and conceptualizing greater meaning in their life. And that's absolutely wonderful and lovely. However, I think that what Bitcoin and what it's inspiring in all of us is going to do is allow us to interpret and articulate and perhaps reconstitute a lot of the meaning and insight and wisdom contained in the various traditions of the past, and represent them and understand them in a higher fidelity form and manner today, to our great benefit, because they obviously are an integral part of the human experience for a reason. And I think our hubris and arrogance in the modern era has caused us to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think they need updating, and I think we need to appreciate the errors and inconsistencies and all the rest of it of the past that have corrupted those institutions and the power of those pursuits. But I don't think we can do without them, as we've been discussing in this conversation. And I'm really excited for how this Bitcoin lens that we're all seeing through now, and how we are being upgraded and evolved as individuals, is going to contribute to a greater clarity, to bring it full circle around those ideas, and hopefully hopefully continue to derive greater clarity over that which is most meaningful to and have that be reflected in our lives. And perhaps there's no greater endeavor to undertake as a human being than that.
Yeah, and it's almost like, people talk a lot how Bitcoin will eliminate institutions that we currently have in place today. And I've kind of always looked at it as Bitcoin acting as a forcing function to realign the institutions towards truth and values that we want to hold as a society, like values that reflect truly valuable things like love, like actual true virtues that matter, right? Like a forcing function rather than just a nuke that takes everything down. And like one of the most common things that I hear when I ask people, like most people know what they need to, just to kind of bring it back to health, most people know what they need to do to be healthy. Like if someone says, I have this problem, and you ask them, well, what do you think you should be doing to get rid of that problem? They can usually tell you the right thing. And so when you ask, well, why aren't you doing that? Most of the time what they say is, I don't have the time. There's not enough time in a day to do this. And, just to get back to what you're saying about, you read a story, now I just spend a lot more time deciding what things to read than actually reading them. And when I read them 2 or 3 times over, because every time I mine more meaning out of it, or I extract something different. And this notion that you can read the Bible and you can over focus on the words and be blind to the meaning of what those words as a cohesive narrative actually mean, right? Like if I have a certain amount of time I need to read something, I go through, I download the words into my brain, but I don't really extract a whole lot out of it. Whereas, if I have a sore knee, I just do whatever I can to get rid of the knee pain, but I don't inquire as to what is the source of my knee pain. Like, what is the lesson here? The lesson is not to do some shit to get out of pain temporarily. The lesson is, what am I doing to my body to generate this knee pain? And this whole idea that Bitcoin, if you adopt it, if you adopt Bitcoin in your life and you choose voluntarily to store your life energy in Bitcoin, the choice to use money that does not steal your time ends up creating a surplus of time to find more meaning in life, ends up creating a surplus of time that allows you the freedom to learn how to take care of yourself. And, that notion that something brings you to Bitcoin, but by aligning your life energy with Bitcoin, you get this massive dividend of a surplus of time to spend how you see fit. And the funny thing is most of the time when you go to Bitcoin and you are given this surplus, Bitcoin shapes what you choose to spend the surplus of energy on. And they're usually things, from my experience, that are more truly important in life, like health, like my relationships. And they tend to to not be things like fame and power and money. And once again, it's just Bitcoin rubbing off on people. Bitcoin not only granting the surplus of time, but also shaping and molding what you choose to spend that time on. It's like, it's influencing humans, myself, starting with myself, but the people around me that I witness it, it's like, it's influencing them so much more than what they might realize. And absolutely. I think it unlocks a huge amount of potential to find more meaning, to explore our curiosity, because we are not forced to adopt a scarcity mindset where I only have a certain amount of time in the day. I must do the essential. And usually the essential is I need to feed myself, I need to pay my mortgage, all that kind of stuff. And when we unlock this like secret of abundance, it's like, well, what do I actually want to spend my time on? Maybe I should think about what I want to spend my time on before spending my time on it. And that's an incredible thing to kind of observe in the people around me. I don't know if it's just my own microcosm, but yeah, it's incredible.
Well, I agree, and I see the same thing. And it's interesting that you end up valuing the thing that gives you that opportunity immensely, right? And so then that causes you to, the things that can't really stand up to that value become relatively diminished, right? So all those like frivolous things that you don't really value, they might have been impulsive or ego-based or whatever before, end up kind of disappearing from your life. And the things that only the things that can contend with such a high value thing remain. And as you say, like the things of greatest value, as we are perhaps rediscovering, are the intangible things, their health and their relationships and their beauty and their family and these sorts of things that sometimes there's a cost to them, but very often there isn't. And so like you end up getting all these Bitcoiners that are basically living like paupers, but they're the most, happy and vital people in the world because their mind, their consciousness is oriented by the things of greatest value. And that's the game. And, so again, like, it's crazy that this internet protocol is the thing that's bringing that all together and fostering it. But also, we talked about before how orienting yourself to these higher conceptual values is liberating in a way, because it relieves you of the need to hyper assess all of your different actions and behaviors. And, oh, did I look good or bad here? Did this? Because you basically have a faith that if you align yourself to those ideals or principles or values, that what happens is, if not the best that can happen, which I think it probably is, it's acceptable to you. And that's what it is. And I think Bitcoin, and so that's one of my favorite quote of all time is, the truth shall set you free. And obviously it's derived from, biblical reference, but I think it's represented in that example. And I think to the one that you were just articulating, and why Bitcoin is so much value is being ascribed to it, and how that is reorienting our value hierarchies and reorienting our perspectives, and therefore reorganizing our lives, let's say, is because it is the highest form of interpersonal truth that we have been able to establish. And it's setting people free, as you just decided. They're having more time in order to determine what's most meaningful. And there's this feedback loop of refinement and value and meaning that's just accelerating and accelerating and accelerating. So I think that quote, "The truth shall set you free," is extremely true in itself. And I think it's represented in perhaps its highest form in the religious narratives, or the kind of distillation of those narratives into more secular language regarding values and principles. And it's also most represented in what Bitcoin is and what it represents to people.
Powerful, dude. If there was a church where you could just go and listen to preachers talk, the Church of Satoshi, and you could just have a lineup of preachers preach the good gospel of Bitcoin, like I would come to every session you did, because I seriously think that it is, I think, having a foundational curiosity of the stories that have shaped humanity, that, are the religious texts, right? The tomes of human wisdom that I think get grossly misinterpreted, but that contains so much essence in there. Even if you don't ascribe to a specific religion, understanding that these stories have clearly had meaning if they've been passed down through such a long time period. And it's like anything, like you extract what is relevant and meaningful to you to be able to shape your understanding of the world. So you don't have to take everything literally, or you don't have to take everything period. But I think having a foundational curiosity of these biblical and religious texts allows you to see Bitcoin, um, allows you to see these religions through the lens of Bitcoin, allows you to see Bitcoin through the lens of religion. And there's like so many, it's almost like there's like all these disparate dots that often have been in my brain, and it's like Bitcoin is connecting all the dots to form a cohesive network of like, this is different than that, but clearly they have a lot of similarities. And to me, the building of those connections is gaining a better understanding of like the rules that govern the world, right? Not just physics and math, but like so many commonalities of, like Dr. Jack Kruse talks about nature as a decentralized health network. And that blew my mind, because he's like, we've gotten centralized with medicine. We've given too much power to too many people, and it's easily corruptible. Whereas nature is this decentralized network that offers us health when we connect with it. And just like Bitcoin is a decentralized monetary network, viewing nature as a decentralized health network completely changed my perspective on how I think about health. It's like, well, I just have to reconnect with the network. And that includes taking plant medicines, eating food that nature provides, spending time with other humans and animals, which are part of that network. And it's just crazy how much Bitcoin has changed my view of everything in the world. And like you said, allowed me to drop things that I no longer consider of equal value to spend my energy on, and accentuated the amount of time I have to explore topics that I truly find meaningful. And then as I explore them, I find so many more connections with the other ones that made the cut. And yeah, it's...
Well, you might say that, both of those things are simply abstractions of something deeper or realer or more truthful, but in forms that allow us to engage them better, because nailing down the constituents of reality is kind of hard, right? But if they can be manifest in more, engageable, abstracted form, then potentially they'd be more useful or beneficial to us. And you might say Bitcoin is that, you might say the religious stories are that, you might say even human beings are that. We are, transmutations or abstractions of something more fundamental or more valuable, or an integration of that or something like that. And I think that's probably the case. I mean, I guess that's my current working hypothesis, is that those two, particularly the Bitcoin and the religious domain, are two of the most high fidelity abstractions, one in the form of story, one in the form of a interpersonal value exchange network, let's say, although it's really hard to define Bitcoin, as we all know, of those deeper truths. And what do we say about the things that are most representative of the most fundamental truths? Well, they always wind up in the pantheon of the highest meaning, and like words, they always wind up in the pantheon of the ineffable, inevitably, because we don't have the language to fully describe or speak to what they are, which is why they're perhaps so powerful, but also so contentious, because right, they can't be easily defined, and therefore they can't be easily maybe defended. But I think what's interesting, and what I do want to try to find more words to contribute to the facilitation of greater clarity about what's happening. And so that's definitely part of what I'm undertaking, is more writing. But I do think ultimately perhaps the most powerful impact will simply be that when people are in the presence of this thing and they engage with it and they receive, a different form of signal, like there's always going to be a form of conscious contribution, which is why like specific articulation or sharing a particular perspective or insights on a certain thing are beneficial, because then we can integrate them and it helps us conceptualize or develop greater clarity around something, and that greater clarity informs our behavior. And to the extent that it's true, then that's probably good. But what's great about Bitcoin is that like you don't need to, it seems to be the case that these changes in behavior, these benefits that you've been describing, can dawn or impact people absent a clearly articulated reason or mechanism why. right? It seems like these changes are just kind of permeating people that are becoming involved or who adopt this thing, absent like uh, a specific description of what's actually going on, you know? So
Right.
there's this like, there's an
It's like they're
osmosis
absorbing it
effect.
through osmosis, not through understanding.
Yeah, exactly.
Dude, that was I appreciate you taking the time. We went 15 over, but I it was a treat listening to you talk. You know, I have all these things written down. We didn't cover any of them, but it was for the better because I think these are much more interesting topics, not things that I usually engage with because I don't have the confidence to be able to speak, you know, of them or have a decent opinion. But I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I appreciate you sharing your health story. I think when we share how we came to be where we are, I think we inspire a lot more people than what we think. And to anyone listening, thanks for being here. John, thanks for your time. If you want to support the project, you can head to bitcoinstoa.com, send some sats to the QR code on the homepage. John, is there anything you want to say in closing before we wrap this up? It could be about health. It could be about something you're working on or just a thought to give the audience.
Just two things, man. One, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I love these, you know, they seem, like we said at the beginning, they seem worthwhile, even if there is a certain element of gratuitousness to them. But, you know, they really help me crystallize thoughts that I'm having, and usually some new insights emerge as a result of them. So I appreciate you being a extremely capable and enjoyable partner in that pursuit. So thank you for that. And then I wanted to thank you for the work you did during the trucker stuff in Ottawa. You know, like I watched it closely. Obviously, it was dear to my heart because I'm a Canadian as well, and had lost a lot of hope, let's say, in that country over the intervening years. And what happened around the truckers was very inspiring. And, you know, watching you be so dedicated and with such integrity, trying to do your best to help out, you know, I just, it was awesome to see. And I'm proud and grateful to know you, and I appreciate the work.
Cool, man. Thanks for that. I look forward to future conversations. If you ever want to, you know, work, get some reps in to work out a concept or talk about anything related to health, I am always available. And thanks for having me on your show as well during the, you know, I think about this, you know, a lot of people, what I wasn't expecting is at the conference, a lot of people came up to me and thanked me for the trucker stuff. And I was like, how do you even know? Like, I was just surprised. It was kind of like overwhelming in a beautiful way. But, you know, the idea that you had me on your podcast to share the word with your audience, the idea that there's a little girl that made cupcakes for truckers, like everyone helped. And I think that was the most beautiful part of that event, was like a beacon of hope where everyone could come together and align their energies of something that like really pulled them. And yeah, I think the aftershocks are still reverberating in ways that might not be as obvious in the world of, you know, like week-long news cycles. I think it's easy to forget about these things, but yeah, it was a powerful experience, and thank you for you know, giving it a voice, and for all your supportive messages and all that stuff. I think it was all done with everyone collectively together. No one person can do anything meaningful in the absence of others. So yeah,
well,
thank
very,
you.
very small contribution on my part, but I agree with you that what happened there will reverberate, as we've been discussing. And anytime things are done in the name of those higher principles that we've discussed this whole conversation, like honesty and integrity and truth and freedom and love, it carries on, as so many you know, songs have celebrated. So I think you're right on that, and it'll be interesting to see in what forms it takes next. So thanks
Agreed.
again for everything.
No worries, John. To everyone listening, have a great day. Thanks for listening, and ciao for now.